Good evening, everyone. I'm Debbie Walter with Union Public Library. I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and I'm thrilled that we are able to have with us Rich Veit, who is an archaeologist, and a professor in the history department, anthropology at Monmouth. He is really a charming guy with a serious subject, so I'm sure you'll all have a good time. I'm going to use this as a commercial to please sign up for our newsletter, which you can do by writing yes in chat and sending it to me, or send me an email, or just let me know one way or another. So I am excited. This is a subject that we talked about over a year ago, Rich and I. So I'm excited tonight to have you join us. Rich?
All right, Debbie, thank you for that very nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. Let me pull up my presentation, and hopefully you can all see that. And this is basically an introduction to New Jersey's historical burial grounds. I like to think of it as a light-hearted introduction to New Jersey's historical burial grounds, sort of a serious topic. And we're going to span about 400 years of history in the next hour. So when folks think about graveyards and cemeteries, they often think of them as scary, spooky places that you want to avoid as long as humanly possible. And this painting by Wyeth, called The Thunderer, really exemplifies that, a group of terrified people in a churchyard. However, I hope to present a different view of cemeteries this evening, where we see them as repositories of information about local history, about art, about genealogy, great sources of information about the communities in which we live today. However, they are also rapidly disappearing resources. And here you can see a gravestone from the 18 teens, from 1815, up at the Church on the Green in Hackensack, New Jersey. And it is literally peeling apart before our very eyes. So these are irreplaceable resources as well, worth studying. The work you'll be hearing about, or the research you'll be hearing about this evening, is based on several years of work that my colleague Mark Nonestide and I did for a book published by Rutgers University on New Jersey cemeteries. And we wanted to cover the state from Sussex County to Cape May, and to try and represent as many different groups of people as we could. One of the things we learned as we were doing our research is that the first gravestones in the state probably weren't stones at all. Instead, they were wooden markers, such as this marker, which is in the Pine Barrens at a place called Atzion. It's about the size of, it's about the size of a football stood on end, frankly. And this type of marker is sometimes called a head and shoulder marker because of its form. Doesn't have anything to do with the shampoo at all. But this style, wooden marker, is very much what we would have seen in many colonial cemeteries in New Jersey. I can't imagine this example is more than maybe 50 years old, because it probably would have been attacked by termites or rotted away. And of course, before settlers from the old world, Europe, Asia, and Africa, arrived in North America, there were Native Americans, indigenous people living here, and they and their ancestors had been here at least 12,000 years. So I think it's important to note some of their grave markers. And this is one that I was able to identify for an individual named Akanikin, and he is buried in the Burlington Friends Meeting House burial ground. And you'll notice he has a wonderful marker and a great inscription. It says, "Be plain and fair to all, both Indian and Christian, as I have been." He passed away in 1681, and actually that led to a bit of a leadership struggle among the Lenape. However, the marker we're looking at was not, in fact, put up until about 1930, and it was put up by the YMCA and YWCA, so it's a much later marker. Oops. This stone in Hackensack may be an original Native American memorial. And it's a little bit unusual. It's carved out of sandstone. It's irregular. There are some initials on it, IIB or HB, for these little arrow-like designs that you can see. A very early date, 1713. Curious design here, perhaps a canoe. And then up here, you'll see another thing carved into it. We suspect that this is a tobacco pipe. Now, we don't know for sure if this is a Native American's grave, but we do know that in this burial ground by the church on the green in Hackensack, Native Americans were buried. So it's a possibility. We sometimes also see modern markers that commemorate ancient Native Americans. And this is one in Succossona, New Jersey. And it marks the place where a number of skeletons were discovered when a church was being expanded in the 1960s. And I think it's very nice that it points out these first New Jerseyans and their presence there. Oh, my mouse is a little touchy today. I'm sorry about that. European and all other Old World settlers started to arrive in New Jersey in the 1600s. And almost immediately we get grave markers. This is a commemorative marker from way down in Cumberland County, New Jersey, at the Cohansey Baptist Church. And it notes that this is essentially the first settler child born in this area. She was born in 1683. She lived a good long life, passing away in 1760. Some of our earliest markers are completely intriguing, I think. And this is in Edison, New Jersey, in what's called the Piscataway Town Burial Ground. It's by a Baptist church. Very large stone. And this, a marker like this would have been called a tombstone in colonial America because it would have covered a tomb. And this particular example has been restored as part of a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout project. It's a little bit hard to read, but I want to go through it with you because the inscription is just amazing. So it starts out by saying, spectators underneath this tomb are two boys that lay in one womb. And then it goes on and it says they were twice told by eating mushrooms for food, rare in a day's time they poisoned were. And the spelling's just atrocious, Poyseond for poison. And it gives us their names, Richard and Charles Hooper, who died in August of 1693. And I think this reflects a real tragedy because I can imagine the Hooper parents saying to Richard and Charles, apparently twice, telling them, do not eat the mushrooms. And like lots of kids, they persisted in their bad behavior, ate the mushrooms, and we see the result of that tragedy here in a tombstone that has survived for centuries in Edison. Here's a fragmentary tombstone that is in the basement or cellar of St. Peter's Church in Freehold. It also has an interesting inscription, maybe by the same carver. So this one reads, here lies interred the body of Thomas Warren. He was born in Plymouth in Devonshire in Great Britain, lived some time in Ireland, and in the 51st year of his age came over a proprietor in, and it's broken off. We can make out a little bit of the words, East Jersey. And for me, that's just fantastic because as someone born and bred here in New Jersey, who's lived most of his life in New Jersey, I do not believe that we New Jerseyans have accents. I believe other people have accents.
True.
But it appears that in this case, Thomas Warren, or whoever was carving the gravestone, thought that the right way to say Jersey was Jarsey. It's almost like pirate talk, don't you think? R, hard R in there. And I think that may give us a clue as to how folks were speaking in the 17th century. Now, here is a design you probably wouldn't pick for a modern grave marker. This is for Miss Sarah Woodruff, buried in the Elizabethtown Presbyterian Churchyard, wife of John Woodruff. She passed away when she was 62 years old in 1727. And the image up here is quite stark, right? A skull, crossbones. This is perfect for Halloween. An hourglass, a pair of little birds, perhaps they're ravens or vultures. And then wrapped around the whole thing, it appears that we have, when I first saw this, I thought these were waves. And I said to my wife as I was taking the picture, look at that, hon, waves. And she said, you're spending too much time in Long Branch. Those aren't waves, those are flames. And I think she's probably right. So this is a pretty grim image, what we might call a mortality image. I've also been asked, was Sarah Woodruff a pirate? And I don't believe she was. There were pirates during this time period. Some of them were women, not too many, but there were some. I think Miss Woodruff was, in fact, a Puritan, and like many Puritans, she felt that most people were not going to heaven. Only a select number of individuals were going to heaven. And the rest of us, well, we had serious thoughts to think about the future. And grave markers like this one, and this style is also very common in New England, I think reflect that Puritan mindset. Now, if we go to parts of rural New Jersey, this is Pennington down by Hopewell, New Jersey. We see sandstone markers that are very simply made. These are essentially homemade markers. So you can imagine Sarah Wilson's family members carving this stone for her in 1800. Much less formal than the marker you just saw. On the other hand, some people went all out. And this is a tombstone in Freehold for David Lyell. And Mr. Lyell was a goldsmith and a silversmith, and apparently was quite successful, so much so that he put a coat of arms on his grave marker. Pretty extraordinary carving. But most early markers in northern New Jersey, certainly in Union and nearby towns like Springfield or Elizabeth, most early markers have these mortality images. And here are two examples. The one over here that was split is in Marlborough, New Jersey, in a graveyard called Toponimus. And you'll notice it's for Alexander Clark, and he too was born in New Jersey. He passed away quite young. He was only 37. Very sad. It actually says that he died with the cancer. And that's kind of amazing because most forms of cancer probably wouldn't have left external marks, or perhaps he had a tumor or something that was visible to his friends. You can also see up here, he's got an hourglass, and very sadly, all of the sand is in fact at the bottom of his hourglass. Over here on the right, we have a sandstone marker. This is up in Ringwood, New Jersey, far northern New Jersey, for Michael Reynolds. It says he was born in Ireland near Mullingar, and he died in 1763. He was only 30. Irish grave markers are very interesting because Irish immigrants often tell us where they're from, their hometown, their home county, or even their parish. How about this cute little fellow? So far we've had these grim skulls and crossbones, what I'm calling mortality images. According to two famous anthropologists, Jim Dietz and Ned or Edwin Dethlefsen from New England, in New England we see mortality images, and then images of cherubs or angels, and then finally images of urns and willow trees. And they attribute those changes to changing religious sensibilities. So this is out by Tewksbury in Lamington, New Jersey. It's not really a death's head, but it's certainly not the way I picture an angel. It really reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt, like sort of glasses and a mustache here. And it's a transitional marker. Now here is a cherub or an angel. And this may not be the way we picture angels today. This is in the Whippany Cemetery. It's for John Bigelow. And we don't know who carved this marker. It's been restored. That's why it looks so very, very good. It's sandstone. We call this carver the East Jersey Soul Carver. And all of his stones look pretty much the same. The eyes are very interesting because they're sort of looking over to the side as if they're expecting the Grim Reaper to pop around the corner. This is not how Mr. Bigelow would have looked rather this is kind of a generic angel image or a cherub. Here are two other examples. The one over here, pretty shapely, don't you think? It reminds me of a Coca-Cola bottle. This is in Westfield in the Presbyterian Churchyard. And what's fun about this, or one of the things that I think is fun about this, is down in the corner, we have the vowels. So do you remember back to maybe elementary school and teachers saying A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y? I imagine the carver saying to his apprentice, like, little Ebenezer, give me the vowels one more time, but put them someplace inconspicuous where the grass will hide them. And Ebenezer going through them and actually carving a little S over here too. This marker on the right is in Woodbridge's Presbyterian Churchyard, and it's for Captain Nathaniel Fitz-Randolph. He died at the Battle of Connecticut Farms during the American Revolution. In fact, right in your backyards, for those of you from Union, 1780. It's only 33. The local folklore is that his stone was used for target practice by British soldiers during the Revolution, and that accounts for all these pock marks that we see. And that may be the case. We don't know. All right, here's another unusual one. Here we are, I believe, in East Hanover, and the carver's done some funny things here. It's a tombstone. We have a coffin. The lid is open. There's a little person inside. That's a little bit ghoulish, don't you think? And then down here, there's a hand, which points us to the name over here. It says Ebenezer Price Sculptor. So he's pretty proud of this. So the backstory for this marker is that it was carved for Mrs. Catherine Eckley. Mr. and Mrs. Eckley had gone to visit their child, who was a student at the College of New Jersey, Princeton University, and they were heading back home through the hills of Morris County. And Mrs. Eckley was peeling an apple with a penknife. She was in a carriage. Mr. Eckley was walking outside the carriage, and the carriage hits a bump, a really unfortunate bump. And Mrs. Eckley stabs herself with the knife accidentally and passes away in her bereaved husband's arms. It's an incredible story. It was written down in the late 1700s, and it's been repeated hundreds of times since, including by me now. I think Mr. Eckley, very lucky fellow that they didn't have detectives or forensic scientists, because it just seems a little almost too contrived to me. But he certainly had a beautiful tombstone carved for his wife. One of the other fun things to look at if you're in a historic cemetery and you're looking at the gravestones are the pieces of poetry, the epitaphs that are carved on the markers. So this is for Silas Getting, who died at the age of 25 in 1777 in Susquehanna. But I like the inscription. It's a little bit humorous. It says, "My fellow youths, the young and gay, you must ere long be turned to clay. And as you would be truly wise, be ready for your last surprise." And, one wonders about that last surprise. So today, let's say you've made it, you've hit the lottery, you're doing well. You want your friends to know that you're successful. You might get a beautiful new car or a big, beautiful house. Colonial times, you might erect a large, very fancy tombstone so that your survivors would realize just how successful you had been. And this is one in St. Peter's Churchyard in Perth Amboy, Jersey. And it's kind of ironic. These are called box tombs, and vandals love them. Unfortunately, I think they often feel that if they pry the lids up, they will find a skeleton looking back at them. There's no skeleton in the box. The skeleton is, in fact, underground. But markers like this one do have a problem, and that is they're very prone to decay, as this one in St. Peter's is doing before our very eyes. We can see some gendered behavior in cemeteries. So this is a grave marker for Miss Catherine, daughter of the Reverend Daniel Thane and Mrs. Mary Close, who died in 1771. She was buried in Elizabeth. In this design at the top, tulips, it appears, some blooming, some in bud, some wilting, reflect the different generations of the family. But this was also a very popular design for young ladies. All right, so today, if you want to purchase something, well, you can go on Amazon or eBay and find it almost immediately. You might look on Craigslist or even on Facebook or even in the yellow pages. Well, let's say it's the 1790s and you want a grave marker. Well, there are no yellow pages and there's no internet. So how do you find one? How do you find a carver? Well, in this case, we're in Edison and the Piscataway Town Burial Ground, and we have a marker for Mrs. Mary Dunham, who died in 1795. She was 52. You can see her initials up there, just like you might have stitched onto a sweater. But then check this out. What is going on? It's Jonathan and Osborne, 1796. Jonathan Hand Osborne is not buried here. He's the gravestone carver, and he's using the stone as a billboard. Northeastern New Jersey, Hudson, Passaic, and Bergen counties all have wonderful Dutch language grave markers. And this is a very good example for Abram Ackerman, carved out of fieldstone, and it's actually carved in Dutch. This is another Dutch language stone. This is in New Brunswick, and it gives us a nice inscription. It's a cherub. It's lost its nose, kind of a fancy one. This was carved by a fellow named Johannes Zuricher, and he could carve in both Dutch and English. He lived in New York City until the American Revolution, and then he fled to Rockland County to get away from the British Army. But it basically says, on the 11th of January in 1684, Johannes Martinus van Harlingen was born at Westbrook in Holland. And he died the 22nd of October, 1768 at Lawrence's Brook in New Jersey. So it's a nice little obituary in stone. I've got some German markers for you too. If we go to northwestern New Jersey, Hunterdon, Warren, and Sussex counties, we see grave markers from early German immigrants. Some of them were Moravians. And I like the Moravians. The Moravians established towns like Bethlehem and Nazareth and Hope. But the Moravians also felt that all people were equal in the eyes of God. And therefore, you don't need a big fancy gravestone. So people got very simple stones like these. However, other German immigrants were not Moravians. And this is in Stillwater, New Jersey, in Sussex County. It's a tall stone. It's about my height, and I'm about 5'8", and it has a lengthy inscription. It says in German, "Here rests in God John George Windemuth, who was born May 11th, 1711, in Punkstad in Europe," which is also very cool because there's no Germany yet. It hasn't come together as a country. And then it says he came to America in 1736. He married Maria Elizabeth Bernhardt in 1739. And I love the way they phrase this in German, but he basically says, and together they had 8 children. He lived in this land 43 years and 3 months. He died in 1782. This is a lot of information. On the 10th of December at 10 o'clock in the evening. And his age was 71 years, leaving behind 3 sons, 3 daughters still living. So it's like his whole biography is here in stone. But there's also something funny going on up here. You may see it looks like there was a face and it's gone. It's erased. And then we have initials. I, and I's are used interchangeably with J's. So it's JGW, JGW, John George Windemuth. I think that the carver produced a stone with a face on it, and the family, maybe they were offended by that. They didn't like it, and the face got erased and replaced with initials. This is another fun one. Here we are. We're down the shore. We're in Rumson, New Jersey, a Tony suburb in Monmouth County where the elite meet, full of beautiful houses. And this is an early burial ground, slate gravestone carved in Rhode Island, and tells us something about the roads in colonial New Jersey, that it would have been easier to get a stone from Rhode Island down to Rumson in Monmouth County by water than it would be to go over land. And it says, here lies the body of Joyce Hans, wife of John Hans, who died February the 14th, but then the date is what I want you to soak in. It looks like 172 and 2/3. So what is going on there? So what's going on is they were changing the type of calendar they were using. So we start the new year on January 1st. Big celebrations, the ball dropping in Times Square. Well, they don't start the new year on January 1st. They're starting it in the spring, the end of March. And this gravestone for a woman who died in February shows that they're not sure which calendar they want to use. So they're kind of covering their bases, putting 1722 or 1723 on it. The American Revolution left behind some interesting memorials. This is one of my favorites. And you'll notice it has a British flag and a Scottish flag by it. It's for a captain in the British Army, William Leslie, who died at the Battle of Princeton. And the backstory is pretty fascinating. So it says, in memory of the Honorable Captain William Leslie, it's carved out of marble and it's been affected by acid rain, of the 17th British Regiment, which is a pretty famous regiment, son of the Earl of Leven of Scotland. So this is a pretty prominent person. And then it says he fell January 3rd, 1777, aged 26 years in the Battle of Princeton. But then it gets interesting. His friend, Benjamin Rush, MD, of Philadelphia, erected this stone. So Benjamin Rush is probably the most famous physician in early America. He's like the Dr. Oz of early America. Everybody knows him. He's like a celebrity doctor and a very effective one. Well, Benjamin Rush studied medicine in Scotland, and he stayed with the Earl of Leven when he was studying medicine. Comes home, and at the Battle of Princeton, Rush is serving with the American troops. And he's on the battlefield after the battle, and he sees this young man, William Leslie, who's dying. And he picks him up and has him transported with the American wounded up towards Pluckham in New Jersey, where he passes away. And it really reflects kind of a family story and the conflict of the Revolution, because Leslie had also courted, or not Leslie, Rush rather, had courted William Leslie's sister unsuccessfully. So this reflects the American Revolution as a civil war. I don't know if we have any realtors in the audience tonight, but if we do, you know that it's all about location. Location, location, location. Well, sometimes in historic churches, we have burials within the structure. And this is a nice example from Christ Church in Shrewsbury. And it's for Elizabeth Ashfield, who is the daughter of the Honorable Lewis Morris Ashfield. She is related to the Lewis Morris for whom Morris County is named. And she's in a place of honor within the church. One of the sadder aspects of New Jersey's history is that despite the fact that we're a northern state, we have enslaved people living in New Jersey well into the 1800s. And this is a marker that speaks to that part of our history. It's in Woodbridge's Presbyterian Churchyard. It's for an individual named Jack. You'll notice it says, in memory of Jack, a colored man who belonged to a pretty horrific phrase today, Jonathan Freeman, who was a faithful servant and died July 23rd, 1825, in the 43rd year of his age. The marker is very interesting. It's been recut. The original one failed. You'll notice the initials at the top, JF. Is that for Jonathan Freeman, Or is that for Jack Raymond? It's hard to say, but it really speaks to this period of our state's history that is sometimes overlooked. Now, we must have looked at a couple dozen gravestones by now, and I haven't shown you any with crosses. You might think that's unusual. Well, most early colonial settlers in New Jersey were not Presbyterians, were Protestants from various denominations. There were a tiny number of Catholics, there were a tiny number of Jewish residents, but not very many. And those Protestant settlers felt that crosses were really inappropriate for gravestones. That was a Catholic symbol. So this is in Madison's Bottle Hill Cemetery. And you'll notice not only do we have a cross, but we also have an entire inscription in French. So this is for a Catholic individual, and he's actually a little bit segregated in the cemetery. He's over at the edge of the cemetery, away from most of the other folks there. All right, we're almost at the end of the 18th century, and here's a wonderful little document that survives in the collections of the Alexander Library at Rutgers University. And it's an advertisement, a handbill, if you will, and it's from Aaron Ross. And I'll read it to you. It says, "The subscriber begs leave to inform the public that he has taken a shop in New Brunswick, Burnett Street, near the Sign of the Leopard, where he proposes carrying on the stone cutting business, where all orders for grave, hearth, building stone, etc., will be attended to with punctuality and the work executed with neatness. Aaron Ross." So far, so good. I mean, that's what we all want from somebody who's working for us, right? Punctuality and neatness. Oh, but sometimes there are problems. And here is a gravestone with a mistake on it. And this must have been very awkward. So it's for, as you can read, in memory of Martha, formerly wife of Michael Moore and late wife of Samuel Jacques. So apparently the carver got the husbands in the wrong order. And I assume that the living husband went into the carver's shop and was probably rather offended. And he had the offending husband's name rubbed out. It's hard to erase in sandstone and replaced with the correct name. This is one of my all-time favorite, if you could have a favorite gravestone. This is one of my all-time favorites. So this is in Stelton Seventh-day Baptist Church in Piscataway. Actually, that's probably Edison. That's Edison. And it says, "Sacred to the memory of Abraham Van Gilder, who was born on the high seas." So imagine poor Mrs. Van Gilder. October 1701. Departed this life February the 28th, 1818, aged 116 years, 4 months. This is a world without HMOs. It's a world without penicillin. This is amazing. This guy must have had such a constitution. But the fine print is really fun too. It says, "Rebel against heaven this man had been, full years, 116. By Christ's free grace, he then became an heir of God, a newborn son." And when I first read this, the way I interpreted it was, holy smokes, Abraham is an atheist right up until like the last year of his life, and then he converts and becomes the Seventh-day Baptist. That's incredible timing. And I imagined him as like a 97-year-old man with a head cold, and people saying like, "Abraham, don't you think you should get some religion?" And Abraham pushing back and saying, "No, I'm fine." And then finally converting. However, one of my students in an awkward moment in class said to me, "I think that's wrong." And what she said was, "I think he's a rebel against heaven because he just isn't going. He stays alive so long." And she may well be right. There are no other Van Gilders in this cemetery, so we don't really know the story other than what's here. All right, so we're up to about 1800. And instead of being at the Union Public Library, let's imagine that we're sitting in a church, church of your preference, and you're looking out the window. And boy, oh boy, does the churchyard look crowded. There's not a lot of space left there. And we're beginning to wonder, like, is that healthy having all these bodies right next to the church? And folks decide that it's time for something new. We see the birth of the cemetery. And this is in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So cemeteries are invented in the early 19th century. Um, Initially, we have what we call the rural cemetery movement. And often these are on edges or fringes of cities. They're beautifully landscaped. They have nice plantings, trees. They're essentially America's first parks, often with reflecting ponds, maybe a receiving vault, and they become tourist spots. Unlike sort of church burial grounds, they're run by corporations. People buy shares in them. And some of the first are established in Philadelphia and Boston and Brooklyn, Jersey City here in New Jersey, and ultimately in Newark and other New Jersey cities. Whoops. Typically, with one of these cemeteries, and this is Evergreen in Newark, you have a gate that lets you know you are entering something special, right? So it's a very Gothic gate as you come in. The gravestones also start to change during this time. They go from sort of two-dimensional markers, grave markers, to three-dimensional monuments. And if you remember back to high school where maybe you got a class ring and you looked at a catalog and there were all sorts of ways of accessorizing your ring, maybe you have a sport put on it or a drama club or a marching band, carvers start to have pattern books. And you could go in and you could pick a marker with the design that you wanted. And the costs would vary. So here's some pattern books and here's some images carved right from them. This is one of my favorite pattern book monuments. My friend Mark Nonestide found this. This is out in Hunterdon County. And it's for Hester Warren, the wife of John Bellis, and she died in 1857. It'll probably come as no surprise to you that Mr. Bellis was, in fact, a gravestone carver. So she got a particularly nice marker. But what I'd point out to you is this little locket of porcelain on the side of the stone, because if we look closely at it, there it is. If we look closely at it, we actually have a portrait from 1857 of Mrs. Bellis, still looking back at us. And that is kind of amazing. So we think of ourselves today, right, with our iPhones, and GPS and everything. We love technology. Well, folks in the 19th century loved technology too. But what was cutting edge for them is old school for us. Amazing that this photo has survived. Here is another 19th century monument. And this one, for me, I just find this a little bit humorous because it's a gravestone that has a picture of a gravestone on it with a fellow visiting. Maybe it's to inspire us to visit cemeteries. And some of these monuments from the 1800s are just incredibly beautiful. This one is in Camden. It's the Richter Monument, beautifully carved, that cherub up there, an urn, the hairy claw feet down at the bottom, just fantastic piece of work. And there it is up close. Oops, sorry. Very sensitive mouse. Okay, other designs start to come forward in the 19th century. The obelisk is one, inspired by new discoveries in ancient Egypt and the translation of Egyptian hieroglyphs by Champollion. This one is believed to be the tallest obelisk in a cemetery in New Jersey, and it's in Neptune, New Jersey. Just outside of Ocean Grove in Asbury Park. And it's for Henry Bennett. And Mr. Bennett made a small fortune with vaudeville houses and later early movie theaters. Victorians also had humor. And this is in Gloucester County. And it's a wonderful overstuffed chair carved in granite. And I hope you don't think less of me if I tell you this, but I sat down in the chair. I should have taken a picture in the chair. And it is it's actually more comfortable than some of the real furniture in my house. So the Fowlers are doing a public service with their cemetery chair. Another thing about the 19th century is that people joined organizations. They believed in belonging to groups. It's kind of the opposite of the famous sociological book, Bowling Alone. And this is a monument to Newark's firemen. And it's an impressive piece with a statue at the top of a fire captain, presumably saying, like, in there, boys, go put that fire out. But it's in a plot for firemen and former firemen. And just wonderful. This is in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. So notice the fire hoses that help make up the gate, or the nozzles, the ladders, the pikes, the helmets up here. There's a theme going, don't you think? It gets even better. The fence is made entirely out of former fire hydrants. You don't want to take your dog for a walk here. It'll take forever. But I mean, just fantastic. Talk about adaptive reuse. The Victorians were also really sentimental, and we see that in their grave markers as well. So here's one for a child who passed away, only three years old, and you can see at the bottom a flower that has a broken stem, and our little son. I mean, it brings, even today, it makes one sad to see it. Some of the things they did in terms of sentimentality from a modern perspective are a little bit macabre and curious. So these are not uncommon in Victorian cemeteries. Little images of sleeping children. Victorians also are probably moved on its own. We go back. Are also somewhat famous for their sentimentality and their ideas about morality. And this is in Blairstown, New Jersey. It's the Tilly Smith marker. She was a young lady who worked essentially as a servant girl at what would become a college there. And she was attacked, sexually attacked, assaulted, and killed as a teenager. And initially, she was buried in an unmarked grave, very sadly. This is by Centenary College. And ultimately, townspeople were so upset by what had occurred that they put up really an incredible monument to Tilly Smith. And one of the things that's interesting is that even today, people leave stuffed animals and other small tokens there. The Civil War was an incredibly horrific conflict. And this is an interesting marker for the Civil War. It's in a cemetery in Long Branch. And you'll notice that it's not, in fact, carved out of stone. It's a metal marker made to look like stone. And it says, erected to the memory of the deceased soldiers of Long Branch and vicinity who served in the war for the Union. This was made by a company called the Monumental Bronze Corporation. They were headquartered in Connecticut, and they build their monuments as cheaper than stone, pardon me, and longer lasting. Given what we see here, that may be the case. So at the end of the 19th century, we have this transition, pardon me, from kind of old-fashioned carving, illustrated here, to modern, professionally produced grave markers. And here you see a designer, maybe a draftsman and a carver, producing a stone. And the result is a new form of art. Really striking pieces like this Knapp family memorial with a beautiful granite block supported by bronze feet. We'll also see some wonderful mausoleums being erected during this time period, houses for the dead. This is the Garrett Hobart Mausoleum. Hobart is Vice President of the United States. Is a Passaic County, actually born in Monmouth County, but spends much of his life, his political career in Passaic County, and he's buried in Passaic County today in a very attractive Greek temple. Maybe the finest mausoleum in the state, this is an old photograph, is for Godfrey Krueger, who's buried in Newark. And if you have consumed beer from a can, you have Krueger's company to thank for that. They were the first to put beer into a can successfully. People had tried to put beverages into cans earlier, but it tended to taste just terrible. It tasted really metallic. And he figured out how to put a liner inside the can to preserve the flavor of the beer or whatever beverage you might be consuming. He made a small fortune as a beer baron in Newark, and he put up a mausoleum for the ages. And I can only imagine, let's say, the local high school principal or bank president, when he came in and put up his mausoleum. It's like, there goes the neighborhood. How do you compete with Godfrey? Inside the mausoleum, there's room for a large number of individuals. I like to think of this jokingly as kind of a perpetual frat party. So you could see over on each side, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So that's 22 people on this level. There's another crypt below it with room for more. So really an architectural masterpiece. Other mausoleums, not quite as large, but just as much fun. George Frederick Harms owned a lighterage company in Jersey City. They took boxes off ships and put boxes on ships, and apparently there's some money in that. And Mr. Harms heard about the discovery of King Tut's tomb and went and visited Egypt. He really enjoyed that visit, came home and decided he wanted his own pyramid, and he got one. It's not huge. It's only, I would say, about maybe 15 feet tall, but it's great. And it's made out of granite and will probably last for centuries, if not millennia. Even has his own sphinxes. And they look very 1920s to me, sort of Rudolph Valentino. Mausoleums also provided an outlet for wonderful artwork in the early 20th century, especially stained glass windows, such as this example, probably a Tiffany piece showing an angel. And here is another example of a memorial stained glass window for a young girl. The Parthenia Downing mausoleum in New Brunswick is a favorite because it actually has a little endowment to pay for its electric bill. It has a light bulb inside that has been on since the 1920s. And the story is that Mrs. Downing, Parthenia Downing, when her husband passed away, would come and visit the mausoleum and sit inside with the light on, looking at her husband's sarcophagus. And she would rub her hand across the surface when she left the mausoleum. And if her long white glove picked up any dust, she would leave it on the desk of the cemetery caretaker as a message to him that he needed to get in there and clean up. Of course, not all of us are captains of industry, so we may not be able to afford our individual mausoleum. And the solution to that problem is the community mausoleum, seen here in the Fairmont Memorial in Newark. This is big enough to hold about 2,000 individuals, so the size of a small college. Inside, you see it decorated for the holidays with lots of wreaths and bunting. And when my colleague Mark and I were in here taking photos, it was fantastic because Alvin, Theodore, and the rest of the chipmunks were all playing through the sound system. So it was so much fun. This is an advertisement for that community mausoleum from the early 20th century. And it shows you why you don't want to be buried in a cemetery, right? It's raining, it's muddy, no one's paying attention, children are clingy. And then, of course, Here's the community mausoleum. It's clean, it's hygienic, children are well behaved, and everyone's paying attention. The other development in the 20th century is the Memorial Park, which is a very conscious reaction to the excesses of 19th century Victorian cemeteries, which have become cluttered, chock-a-block full of gravestones. So it's a cleaner alternative, easier to mow, and it starts out in California, where a fellow named Hubert Eaton comes up with the idea, and it spreads across the continent. This is the George Washington Memorial Park in Paramus, New Jersey. Again, a great gate. You get inside, wonderful reflecting pools, beautiful sculpture, but the markers themselves are minimized. However, for the last segment of our presentation, some folks do their own things, and that is perhaps the most fun stuff to look at in cemeteries. So at the same time that memorial parks are coming along, new immigrants from Europe are coming to the United States and bringing their own memorial traditions with them. So this is a Jewish cemetery in Newark, in very good shape. Wonderful markers, many of which display enamel portraits of the deceased. So it's almost like a photo album of this community. This is another Jewish cemetery. This is in Roosevelt. This is in Roosevelt, New Jersey, home to a famous Jewish artist colony. Jacob Landau, Ben Shahn, and others were all members of this community and very artistic monuments. Other markers reflect different events, if you will. The marker on the left that says New Era is for victims of a terrible sinking of a ship off Deal Beach in 1854. It was a German immigrant ship coming to New York, went down in a terrible storm, had about 500 people on it, of whom some 240 lose their lives and wash up over the next couple weeks in what today would be Ocean Grove, Asbury Park, Deal, Long Branch, and they're buried beneath this monument in a mass grave in the old First United Methodist Cemetery in Long Branch. Charles Dixon was a cabin boy on a ship lost at sea, and his crewmates erected a really wonderful monument to him in Neptune, and they put a ship's anchor by him. The Civil War, again, it's a watershed event in American history. And among other things, we see the government providing long-lasting, attractive individual monuments to service personnel, soldiers, sailors following the war. And this makes a huge difference for folks who may not have deep pockets and be able to afford very expensive grave markers. So if you've served, you'll get a marker. And this is in Eatontown, New Jersey, in the White Ridge Cemetery, and it's for William Powell, who was a private in the 9th U.S. Cavalry during the Indian Wars and was an African-American soldier or a Buffalo soldier. Here's a marker for a rather dapper gentleman in the same burial ground. Oops. Other new immigrants in the 19th century coming to the United States are coming from Germany and Austria and Hungary. They bring different traditions with them as well. And this is a wonderful example of an iron grave marker. We see these put up by French, German, Austrian, sometimes Hungarian immigrants. And it's just like a tour de force of the blacksmith's art. Italian immigrants come to New Jersey in great numbers. Many initially don't have a lot of financial resources, but ultimately, over generations, they acquire capital. They're able to put up some pretty incredible monuments, such as this one, for Andrea Massey, who was a musician. You'll notice not only does he have a lyre down here on the stone, but he's also holding a trumpet. Materials are fun to look at too. This is in a Polish cemetery in Linden, And it's from 1929, the Depression, and it's a concrete grave marker. It's real folk art. It's concrete and bathroom tile, sort of beautifully repurposed as a grave marker. In the back of this says Frank Blasco, builder, Linden NJ, and then it gives you a 4-digit phone number that you can call, and you can say, Frank, that's fantastic. I've got some bathroom tile. Can you make a marker for me? He does good work. Little known fact is that we have the Ukrainian National Cathedral here, Ukrainian Orthodox National Cathedral, right here in New Jersey, St. Andrews. It's in southbound Brook, and it has some of the most magnificent monuments you'll see anywhere, including this life-size bronze Cossack. Pretty intimidating to come around a boxwood and stumble on this fellow. This is a fun one. Mykola Zaborsky, engineer of bridges. Notice his bridge. We also have a significant Romani or Gypsy community here in the state. And this is Evergreen Cemetery in Hillside. There are a number of Evergreen cemeteries. This is for Singing Sam Stevens, the Music Man. It's a Gypsy monument par excellence. Here is Sam. And here are some of his greatest hits as a musician. I can't say that I recognize them, but I assume they are greatest hits within the Romani culture. Nearby, we have Big G and Lovable Rose. The humor, the wit, the energy in these markers, just wonderful. Big G is George. George has passed away, but Lovable Rose was still with us when I took this photo. In Jackson, New Jersey, there's a wonderful Russian Orthodox church, St. Vladimir's, and in Cassville. And by it, there are some just fantastic markers, including some Buddhist markers, interestingly enough, or Kalmyks, displaced people from the former Soviet republics. And they have almost stereotypical sort of Soviet or Russian sounding names, like Natalia Badmanova. You'll notice the prayer wheel at the top of the mark. Modern Chinese cemeteries, this is Cloverleaf Memorial Park in Woodbridge, have wonderful, colorful monuments, often erected following Feng Shui principles. In Passaic County, there's a significant and fascinating Turkish and Middle Eastern population. So there are Muslim sections of cemeteries. And here you can see Father Mecca Ali with Mount Ararat. And there is the Great Mosque in Istanbul. And instead of having the Bible open, we have the Quran open. I'm sorry about that. Here are some Egyptian grave markers in Linden. And I love the voyage represented by the ship on the gravestone there for Halim Yusuf Hambuz. Again, going back to materials, folks have experimented with different types of materials over time. And here you see 2 ceramic terracotta grave markers. Terracotta is a material that was used in buildings like the early skyscrapers, such as the Woolworth building. And here it was employed for gravestones in Perth Amboy, a city where a lot of terracotta was made. So this is true folk art. This is also a ceramic monument. This is in Metuchen. It's for a boy named Bruno Grandelis. You can see the wonderful sculpture of Bruno being carried heavenward by an angel. And on the back, it says, "Your father made this, AD 1905. Unfortunately, the glaze is falling off the ceramic, but a wonderful, wonderful marker. I don't think this is a good idea, but I've seen this as well. This is down by Tuckerton in Ocean County. This is a plastic memorial. I can't imagine, having mowed a lot of lawns as a young person, that this will be long lasting. Hold on a second. There's also, there are curious individual stories in cemeteries, sometimes perhaps humorous stories. So this memorial reads, in memory of Charles H. Salmon, who was born Friday, September 10th, 1858. He grew, waxed strong, and developed into a noble son and a loving brother. He came to his death the 12th of October, 1884, by the hand of a careless drug clerk and two excited doctors at 12 o'clock at night in Kansas City. And you just have to say, what is the story here? It has all the makings of a novel. We see military service in cemetery. The Abram Philhauer marker for a soldier who died during the First World War. We see hobbies. The inverted Jenny is perhaps the most famous American postage stamp that collectors lust after. And here it is on a gravestone in Rahway. Oh, wait a minute. Can't skip these. And finally, there's humor. So I have bad news for all of you. If you are looking for the world's greatest electrician, he's passed away. Here he is, Sal Giardino, the world's greatest electrician, complete with his license number and an outlet. You just can't beat that. Kim Giardino, his daughter, has also passed away, and I love her marker, World Peace. Ray C. in Linden, New Jersey, sort of takes the cake with a life-size granite Mercedes-Benz, complete with vanity plates. The backstory here is that Ray was promised a car by his parents when he got his driver's license. He passed away young. They kept that promise. They still got him a car. Kind of amazing. This is both sad and sort of fun. Bruce Berman was an art and design professor, as I understand it, who passed away young. And as I have heard the story, he and his students came up with the design for his marker, which reminds me a lot of Han Solo being cryogenically frozen. But my favorite bit of this is the fact that he has his web address on his grave marker. So www.bermananimation.com. And that is such a 20th or 21st century thing. So I think the hardest tickets to get on Broadway as Broadway reopens are for Hamilton. But I've got good news for you. You can go visit Aaron Burr anytime you want in the Princeton Cemetery. It's wide open and he's there. This is his gravestone. It's pretty interesting in terms of what it calls out. It says a colonel in the Army of the Revolution, Vice President of the United States, 1801 to 1805. He was Vice President under President Jefferson. Dudley Moore is buried in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, and I love the fact that he has a piano-shaped grave marker, very appropriate. But there are also some sad things. This is in Hamilton Township. Here we're looking at a prison cemetery, and people have just been reduced to numbers. A little more humor. Doris Christensen DiCarlo has bingo, like permanent bingo, I think. And she is in Colestown, Camden County. There are other forms of humor. Marvin Penn, whom I knew, is described here as a family man and a mensch, and he really was. He's a hardware store owner in Plainfield. William Hahn lived in Princeton. There are a lot of witty people in Princeton. I told you I was sick. Well, he wasn't kidding this time. And James Bechtold has, he's over the top, the Three Stooges on a gravestone in Metuchen. So humor in the cemetery. This is another favorite for the cemetery aficionados. John O'Brien is a great student of early American gravestones, and his marker says he loved history. He is history. And then finally, man's best friend, pets. Squeaker Moshe, the boss, my best friend, the joy of my life, apparently a Jewish cat. Killer Vernotico, killer dog, the best dog I ever saw. We love you. I picture killer as like a teacup poodle in my head. And then to wrap up, I hope you've seen how cemeteries can tell us all sorts of stories about our shared past as a society. But they're also endangered resources. This is a Jewish cemetery in Newark, where many of the markers have been knocked over. It's been terribly vandalized. Here's a rural cemetery in Colts Neck, Monmouth County, completely overgrown and pretty much impassable. So my parting thought for you comes from this marker for Mrs. Coutreneo in Oceanport. And the backstory here is that she was a protective mom, and she would stay up late waiting for her sons to come home. And when she heard their car in the driveway, she could go to sleep. So when she passed away, her sons had her sculpture carved, listening for them, as though she were listening for them to come home and watching over them. So I like to take a lesson from Mrs. Coutreneo and say, if we visit and look at and listen to the stories that New Jersey's historic cemeteries have to tell, we can learn an awful lot about our great state and its past. So thank you very much for your attention this evening.
Thank you, Rich. I'm going to stop recording now so that we can ask some questions. I'm going to do that right now. Thank you for listening.